A seismic shift has just shaken the global economic order. Canada has unleashed a $760 billion counteroffensive in response to Trump's tariffs, and the ripple effect was immediate. Within days, the European Union followed suit, launching its own $40 billion retaliatory package. This isn't just a trade dispute, it's the opening salvo of what may evolve into a full-scale global trade war. The European Union's swift and calculated reaction came after President Trump enacted a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, triggering alarm across America's closest allies. In response, the EU announced tariffs worth €26 billion, approximately $40 billion, targeting over 2,800 U.S. products, from Levi's jeans to whiskey, and even Boeing aerospace components. According to Bloomberg, the move signals a new era of transatlantic tensions unseen since the Cold War, and reflects a coordinated retaliation meant to inflict economic pain while minimizing damage to European industries. Brussels wasn't bluffing. It was striking back with surgical precision. This sudden chain of economic blows sets the stage for what one EU diplomat described to Reuters as a tit-for-tat spiral that could destabilize global trade networks. Then, the real question now is, has the U.S. underestimated the scale of the backlash it just triggered? As tensions with the United States rise, both Canada and the European Union are no longer waiting for Washington to change course. They're actively rewriting the rules of trade. The EU's retaliatory measures have already hit U.S. industries where it hurts: machinery, vehicles, and agricultural exports like fruits, vegetables, and wine are all on the chopping block. But perhaps more consequential is the shift already underway. Trade between Canada and the EU has grown by 7% since the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, took effect, a clear sign that North America's northern powerhouse is pivoting away from U.S. dependence. As reported by the Wall Street Journal, Canadian businesses are rushing to tap into new markets in Europe and Asia, rerouting supply chains and reducing exposure to U.S. tariffs. This isn't just diversification, it's economic insulation. One Canadian trade official described the move as an economic firewall against erratic U.S. policy, and the numbers back it up. A growing wave of Canadian companies is already making strategic exits from American markets, seeking long-term security in more stable trade environments. The dominoes are falling, and the United States may soon find itself on the outside of trade blocs it once dominated. While Canada and the EU strike back with precision, Mexico and Brazil have taken a noticeably different path. Rather than rushing into retaliatory tariffs, both nations are biding their time, playing a longer, more strategic game. But don't mistake restraint for weakness. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has chosen negotiation over escalation, but he's left no doubt about his country's readiness to act. "We're prepared to impose tariffs if necessary," he warned, even as his government works quietly behind the scenes to stabilize its export markets. According to a report by Reuters, Mexico's steel industry is already bracing for reduced output, while its agricultural sector faces a ticking clock. U.S. tariffs on tomatoes and avocados could devastate rural economies if left unchecked. Brazil, the second-largest steel exporter to the U.S., finds itself in a similarly precarious position. Finance Minister Fernando Haddad didn't mince words, calling Washington's tariffs irrational and dangerous. Brazil has now filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization, signaling a pivot toward legal countermeasures over economic retaliation. But there's a deeper truth here. These nations know the cost of miscalculation. A full-scale trade war could send shockwaves through their fragile recoveries. Instead of matching Trump's aggression with fire, they are wielding leverage with surgical precision. The question is, how long can restraint hold when the White House keeps tightening the screws? While global allies brace for impact, the blowback is already being felt on U.S. soil. The domestic steel industry, the very sector these tariffs were designed to protect, is now caught in a paradox. Higher import costs are inflating production expenses for American manufacturers across the board. The irony is brutal. By attempting to shield the steel sector, the U.S. has driven up the price of raw materials for its own industries, from construction to automotive, undermining competitiveness at home and abroad. A recent analysis by the Wall Street Journal highlighted that U.S. steel prices have surged nearly 15% since the tariffs were announced, forcing downstream manufacturers to either absorb losses or pass costs onto consumers. Both options are economically painful. And as European tariffs hit back on over 2,800 U.S. products, from Levi's jeans to Boeing aerospace components, the pain isn't theoretical, it's operational. Factories are reassessing supply chains, exporters are losing market access, workers are questioning their job security. This isn't a defensive measure anymore. It's a direct hit, one that's shaking confidence across the American industrial heartland. In what many are now calling an unprecedented escalation, the U.S. sharply increased tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum from 25% to a staggering 50%. The move came just hours after Ontario announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., a measure that directly impacts 1.5 million homes in states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. President Trump responded in characteristically combative fashion. "Canada is taxing our electricity. We'll hit back even harder." But if Washington expected Canada to fold, it severely miscalculated. Canada's retaliation was not only immediate, it was surgical. Ontario escalated threats to cut electricity exports altogether, putting American grid reliability at risk during peak demand. British Columbia imposed tolls and import restrictions on U.S. trucks passing through to Alaska and tightened controls on American fuel and food imports. This wasn't just a trade spat anymore. Provinces like Nova Scotia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Newfoundland launched economic countermeasures within 24 hours, banning U.S. firms from government contracts, pulling U.S. goods from state-run stores, and more. Canada had drawn a red line. The message? If you weaponize trade, we will nationalize the response. And the fallout? U.S. Freight firms are now scrambling to reroute goods, retailers are reevaluating supply chains, and American businesses operating in Canada are bracing for regulatory backlash. The economic war has entered a new, dangerous phase, and there's no turning back. Canada isn't just retaliating, it's actively rewriting its trade playbook. In the wake of U.S. tariffs, the Canadian government has turbocharged negotiations with Europe, Asia, and Latin America, accelerating its pivot toward economic independence. From Brussels to Jakarta, Ottawa is locking in new trade agreements aimed at diversifying exports and reducing reliance on the U.S. market. According to data from Global Affairs Canada, talks with partners like the EU and ASEAN nations have intensified, with a clear mandate: find new buyers, shift supply chains, and future-proof the Canadian economy. Meanwhile, back in Washington, it appears this dramatic escalation caught U.S. policymakers flat-footed. The S&P 500 tumbled 0.8% within hours of Trump's tariff announcement. Key players in the steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors such as U.S. Steel, Alcoa, and GM posted sharp intraday losses, sending shockwaves through financial markets. According to Bloomberg, the steel and aluminum price spike is already compressing profit margins across multiple sectors, particularly in construction and consumer goods. Automakers are facing a double blow: supply chain chaos and surging input costs, a combination that could push vehicle prices to historic highs. The consequences of this trade war are no longer theoretical. They're bleeding into boardrooms, budgets, and balance sheets. Canada has made its move. The question now: will U.S. industries break before Washington bends? Canada's retaliation isn't just economic, it's surgical. Just 2 days after the U.S. imposed sweeping tariffs, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government struck back with a 25% tariff on $30 billion worth of American goods, and it's just the opening salvo. Plans are already in motion to expand that figure to $125 billion in the coming weeks. Targeted products include not only agricultural exports like corn and dairy, but also industrial machinery and everyday consumer goods, ensuring that American farmers, manufacturers, and middle-class families all feel the sting. This is no scattershot response. It's calculated pain. And Trudeau isn't stopping at tariffs. Canada is taking the fight to Geneva, lodging a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, arguing that the U.S. measures violate international trade norms. According to Reuters, Canadian officials insist these tariffs are economically indefensible and represent nothing more than political protectionism under the guise of national security. But perhaps the most devastating blow came not from Parliament, but from Ontario. Premier Doug Ford blindsided Washington by slapping a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the U.S., targeting a resource that powers more than 1.5 million American households in states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. This is no longer just a trade dispute. Canada is weaponizing energy, and Washington may have underestimated just how far their northern neighbor is willing to go. Ontario Premier Doug Ford didn't just fire back, he escalated, following the U.S. tariff hike. Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., directly impacting power grids in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. In 2024, the U.S. imported nearly 39 terawatt-hours of electricity from Canada, 95% of which came from hydroelectric plants in Ontario and Quebec. That energy keeps American homes warm, factories running, and transit systems moving. And this isn't just about higher bills. Ford warned that if the U.S. doesn't reverse course, Ontario may cut off electricity exports entirely. Such a move could trigger rolling blackouts across multiple U.S. states during peak demand, risking lives and paralyzing local economies. This is energy diplomacy at its sharpest edge. If Washington wants to turn up the heat, we'll show them what cold really feels like, Ford quipped in a press statement, underlining the high-stakes nature of the standoff. Experts from the Brookings Institution caution that weaponizing energy flows in this way could ignite a new era of economic hostilities where infrastructure, not just imports, becomes leverage. The message from Ontario is clear. Push harder, and we'll flip the switch. Literally. But Ontario wasn't done. Premier Doug Ford ramped up the pressure with threats that stretch beyond electricity. His government is now considering canceling a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink, a move that could disrupt satellite internet access in remote regions across Canada. In a digital economy, this is no small gesture. It's a direct message to Silicon Valley. No nation, no company is untouchable in this trade war. Even more symbolic is Ford's proposal to ban the sale of American alcohol in LCBO stores, Canada's largest liquor retailer. That decision could inflict significant losses on U.S. beverage producers, particularly in border states like New York and Michigan, where distilleries and vineyards rely heavily on Canadian customers. While these may seem like unconventional tools in a trade dispute, they are deliberate and calculated. We'll defend our economy with everything we've got, whether that's megawatts or Merlot, Ford remarked sharply in a televised address. As Bloomberg analysts noted last week, these measures signal a deeper shift in how provinces like Ontario view their economic autonomy, from reactive to proactive, from partner to challenger. The days of quiet diplomacy are over. Canada is hitting where it hurts, from Wall Street to whiskey barrels. Ontario may be striking back hard, but it's not immune to the fallout. As Canada's industrial heartland, Ontario's economy is deeply intertwined with U.S. trade flows. Sectors like automotive manufacturing, steel production, and high-tech depend heavily on cross-border supply chains. If this trade war drags on, Ontario itself could suffer significant collateral damage. Production delays, rising input costs, and potential factory shutdowns loom large. We're not naive about the risks, Premier Ford admitted in a press conference, but we will not be economically blackmailed by anyone, especially not our closest neighbor. To cushion the blow, Ontario has rolled out a $40 billion economic defense package. It includes payroll subsidies, tax relief for manufacturers, and direct support for struggling businesses. According to Reuters, this fund is designed to buy time, giving local industries a fighting chance while trade routes are restructured and export strategies recalibrated. But the clock is ticking. And while Ontario stands firm, the broader question remains: How long can any province wage economic war without incurring deep internal scars? While Washington projects energy independence, the numbers tell a different story. Canada remains a critical artery in the American energy system, supplying over 50% of U.S. imported oil, vast volumes of natural gas, hydroelectric power, and even uranium. Without this steady northern flow, the U.S. would face soaring gasoline prices, strained utility grids, and potential supply shortages in critical industries. In fact, Bloomberg reported that Canada's energy exports to the U.S. in 2023 exceeded $130 billion, underlining just how deep the dependency runs. Transportation networks, manufacturing hubs, and entire state economies, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest, are tethered to this lifeline. As trade tensions escalate, energy is no longer just a commodity, it's leverage, a strategic tool, and Canada now holds that tool with a steady grip. The question facing U.S. policymakers: what happens if Ottawa decides to twist? The United States may be the world's largest economy, but its vulnerability is now fully exposed. Just days after Canada retaliated with its $760 billion response package, Mexico and Brazil began signaling coordinated pressure. Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, warned that energy and auto part flows to the U.S. could be cut if negotiations fail. That's not an empty threat. Mexico supplies roughly 1 million barrels of oil per day and millions of car components to American factories. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. refineries in Texas and California are already modeling worst-case scenarios, a 30% spike in operational costs if Mexican oil slows. Meanwhile, Reuters reports that automakers like GM and Ford, heavily reliant on Mexican production lines, are bracing for disruption. If Mexico joins Canada in restricting exports, the U.S. could be staring down a double-edged trade war, one fueled by energy and automotive supply chain chaos. What was once a tactical tariff may now be spiraling into a continental economic breakdown. As tensions soar, Mexico is drawing a red line. President Claudia Sheinbaum, while advocating diplomacy, has made it crystal clear: if the U.S. doesn't step back, Mexico will strike where it hurts. On March 6th, Sheinbaum is scheduled for a direct call with President Trump, a last-ditch effort before the gloves come off. And the stakes? Monumental. According to Bloomberg, Mexico is preparing retaliatory tariffs targeting U.S. agricultural exports: corn, soybeans, beef, the very lifeblood of Midwest America. These exports account for billions in revenue and underpin tens of thousands of U.S. farming jobs. One senior Mexican trade official told the Financial Times, "If Trump wants a trade war, he better be ready to explain it to the American farmers who will lose their markets first." And it doesn't stop there. Mexico could blacklist U.S. companies, effectively choking off access to a manufacturing hub that has kept costs down for decades. CNN Business warns that U.S. multinationals like Ford and Whirlpool may be forced to reroute operations, risking massive delays and inflationary pressure across the North American consumer market. The March 9th announcement from Mexico will be pivotal. What happens next could either diffuse a regional trade explosion or unleash a full-scale economic standoff that no side can afford. As Mexico gears up for possible retaliation, the United States finds itself cornered, not just by one neighbor, but two. Canada, already deep in its economic counteroffensive, shows no signs of retreat. "We're not backing down. We're building our future beyond America," Prime Minister Justin Trudeau declared in a televised address that aired across Canada on March 4th. Just 2 days after the latest round of U.S. tariffs, Canada struck back with surgical precision, imposing a 25% duty on $30 billion worth of American goods, with plans to ramp that to under $25 billion. The targets? High-impact essentials, agricultural produce, machinery, and daily-use consumer goods. The Wall Street Journal reported that these measures are designed to hit U.S. exporters in politically sensitive states like Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, right where it hurts most. And that's not all. Canada has now escalated the matter to the World Trade Organization, claiming Washington's tariffs are a textbook case of economic protectionism. The goal is clear: isolate the U.S. diplomatically while winning legal ground globally. But the real shock came not from lawyers or lawmakers, but from Ontario. The province is no longer just taxing American imports, it's going after America's energy grid. Starting March 10th, Ontario's 25% electricity tariff takes effect, directly threatening power supply to over 1.5 million households across Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. The message from the North is now thunderously clear: push harder, and we'll push back, faster, deeper, and more decisively than you expect. Energy is no longer just a commodity, it's now a strategic weapon in this escalating trade war. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford took the gloves off, declaring that if the U.S. doesn't roll back its tariffs, the province is ready to cut electricity exports entirely. If Washington wants to play hardball, Ford warned, then it's time they learn what economic power really looks like. In 2024 alone, the U.S. imported nearly 39 terawatt-hours of electricity from Canada, 95% of which came from Ontario and Quebec. These supplies keep factories running in Michigan, transit systems moving in New York, and homes heated in Minnesota. A full energy cutoff could cause blackouts during peak demand, raise electricity prices by double digits, and paralyze regional industries. But Ontario isn't stopping there. Ford announced plans to slap surcharges on every exported megawatt-hour of electricity, pricing U.S. buyers out of the market. And in a surprising twist, the province is also reviewing a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink, which could disrupt satellite internet services across remote parts of North America. The targeting continues at the consumer level, too. Ontario is weighing a ban on American alcoholic beverages in LCBO, the country's largest liquor retailer. That move would devastate U.S. beverage exports, particularly from states like New York and California. The gloves are off, and energy has become the sharpest blade in Canada's economic arsenal. Ontario's retaliation may be fierce, but it's not without risk. As Canada's industrial powerhouse, the province is walking a tightrope, striking back at U.S. aggression while shielding its own economy from collateral damage. Key industries like automotive manufacturing, steel production, and technology are tightly woven into U.S. supply chains. A prolonged trade war could shatter that fabric. To brace for impact, Premier Ford's government has launched an emergency $40 billion economic relief package, one of the largest in Canadian provincial history. It includes tax breaks for manufacturers, payroll subsidies to prevent layoffs, and direct financial aid for businesses caught in the trade crossfire. Ford's message is clear: we will not be bullied, and we will not let Ontario fall. Still, the question lingers: how long can Ontario sustain this level of economic warfare without suffering deep internal damage? Every dollar spent on relief is a dollar not invested in innovation, education, or long-term growth. The political gamble is monumental. If the U.S. doesn't back down soon, Ontario could face its own version of an economic crisis. The United States may pride itself on energy independence, but the numbers tell a different story. In 2023, Canada supplied more than 50% of U.S. oil imports, an artery that keeps the American economy running. Natural gas, electricity, and uranium from Canada power entire regions, from homes in Michigan to factories in New York. But that flow is no longer guaranteed. Canada is now pivoting, sending oil and LNG to Asia, where nations like Japan and South Korea are eager to pay top dollar. The expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline offers a faster route to Pacific ports and higher margins than the U.S. market. That means Washington's long-term access to cheap, reliable energy is under serious threat. What's more alarming is that Canada isn't just diversifying out of profit, it's retaliating. As Prime Minister Trudeau declared, "Our tariffs are targeted to inflict maximum pain on the U.S. economy with minimal damage at home." For the first time in decades, energy has become a geopolitical weapon, and the U.S. is on the receiving end. What began as a tariff dispute has morphed into a national awakening. The U.S. trade aggression has triggered something rare in Canada, an eruption of patriotic unity. Citizens from Vancouver to Halifax are rallying behind their leadership, determined to defend economic sovereignty. Retailers are boycotting U.S. goods, consumers are switching to domestic brands, and a swelling chorus of voices is calling for long-term economic independence. Politically, the consequences are seismic. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, once criticized for his soft approach, is now enjoying a dramatic surge in approval. His government's firm stance against Washington has not only galvanized public support, but it has also redefined the Canadian political landscape. In Trudeau's own words, "We will not be bullied. Canada will chart its own economic future, free from foreign coercion." This defiant momentum is not just reactive, it signals a permanent shift in how Canada sees its role in the world. As tensions with the United States escalate, Canada isn't just retaliating, it's realigning. The Trudeau administration is moving decisively to diversify trade, shifting focus toward Asia and Europe. Deals with Japan and South Korea are no longer diplomatic gestures, they're economic lifelines. Canada is pushing aggressively to expand exports of energy, technology, and agriculture to these high-growth markets. According to data from Statistics Canada, exports to Asia rose 12% in the last quarter alone, while trade volume with the European Union is at an all-time high. This isn't just a shift in numbers, it's a shift in national strategy. Canada is actively rewriting its place in the global trade order, reducing vulnerability to U.S. policy swings, and building alliances that reflect a multipolar world. The North American trade dynamic may never return to what it once was. Canada's transformation from a U.S.-reliant trade partner to an assertive global player is no longer theoretical, it's happening in real time. While Washington grapples with rising inflation and strategic missteps, Ottawa is executing a long-term vision, building economic sovereignty and political resilience. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, once criticized for a cautious approach to foreign policy, is now being praised for navigating the country through a historic economic realignment. Analysts at Bloomberg note that Canada is leveraging crisis into opportunity, positioning itself as a reliable alternative to the volatility of U.S.-centric trade. This is more than retaliation, it's reinvention. As the dust settles on the opening salvos of this economic standoff, a sobering question emerges. Has the United States underestimated the cost of alienating its closest allies? Canada's defiance is not an isolated response. It's a signal to the world that Washington's era of unilateral dominance in trade may be ending. With new partnerships solidifying across Europe and Asia, the global balance is shifting. According to a recent report from the Wall Street Journal, U.S. businesses are already lobbying for policy reversals, warning that prolonged trade wars risk permanently ceding market share to foreign competitors. And while Canada sharpens its strategy, the U.S. finds itself in reactive mode, scrambling to regain footing in a world no longer willing to wait. The road ahead isn't just about tariffs, it's about credibility, resilience, and the future of leadership in the global economy.